the reactions to modernist architecture and planning discussed in chapters 2 and 3 can be mapped along two axes, one indicating the formal ambitions of urban designers and the other the ways in which they perceive their role. These axes meet at the point where urban designers aspire to realize their personal artistic and financial ambitions, with little or no theoretical justification entering the mix, and the axes diverge along the designers' respective theoretical paths. The formal ambition axis moves from producing good and beautiful built forms to drawing inspiration from mass culture, the social context, the site, and the past. The urban designer's role axis proceeds from the businessperson and artist to the facilitator, political activist, and social engineer. Although the reactions to modernist architecture and planning might be mapped along these axes, such an exercise would ultimately reveal little, since theory is often a mask or justification for personal ambitions or vice versa. Rather than chart the rhetoric of these various approaches, then, this chapter peers beyond it, by reviewing and assessing the major themes which fall along the axis of postmodern urbanism as inscribed within the larger postmodern reflex outlined in the preceding chapter. Fictionality, depthlessness, ephemerality, fragmentation, populism, apoliticism, commercialism, loss of faith, and irony. The critique of postmodern urbanism advanced in this chapter is organized as follows: form follows fiction, form follows fear, form follows finesse, form follows finance, and the result. The concluding section, on balance, presents certain correctives of postmodern urbanism as well as promising initiatives that have emerged in the 1990s. The challenge to the modern project and the decline of the public realm to which modern urbanism was accomplice called for new responses from urban designers. Whereas modernism from the 1910s to the 1960s responded to the challenge of establishing social order for a mass society. Postmodernism since the 1960s responded to the challenge of placelessness and a need for urban community. The axis of postmodern urbanism. THEURBANDESIGNERSROLE certain pasts the site, the social context, beauty, artist, businessperson, TOAC high personal fulfillment in terms of artistic ambitions, notoriety, and a remuneration, FA salida TOGIV people what the you want, social engineer, to see hangy people, assuming n veer on mental determinism and superior judgment of designer, political activist, TO empower people, mass culture roles to effect change through urban design in contrast to modern urbanism's insistence upon structural honesty and functionality. Postmodern urbanism sought to satisfy needs that were not merely functional and to convey meanings other than the building tectonics. In architectural theory, Ada Louise Huxtable observed, there was a search for meaning and symbolism, a way to establish architecture's ties with human experience, a way to find and express a value system, a concern for architecture in the context of society. As modernism's minimalist tendencies grew ever more stifling, urban designers embraced maximalism and inclusivity, as expressed in the maxims less is a bore and more is more. The parallel shift occurring in literature is evocatively portrayed by the protagonist in John Barth's Tidewater Tales, a writer whose increasingly minimalist style ultimately blocks his ability to write or dream until circumstances reignite his creative juices, this time in a maximalist form. Likewise, in urban design theory, universalism and purism were gradually supplanted by pluralism and contextualism, while the role of the urban designer shifted from that of inspired genius, artist, or social engineer to that of a more humble, and at times servile, facilitator. FORMFOLLOWSFICTION. Whereas modernist architecture and urban planning derived inspiration from the machine to house an industrial society, many reactions to modernism since the 1960s have sought inspiration from pre-industrial townscapes for a post-industrial society. While certain outcomes of these efforts have been salutary, the two-part denial inherent in them often render success elusive or merely partial. This denial entails a reluctance to acknowledge that post-industrial needs and tastes can differ vastly from pre-industrial ones, along with a related tendency to edit history, valorizing and idealizing selective pasts while denigrating and erasing others, particularly our most recent past, that of modernism. In its determination to improve upon modernist urban design, postmodern urbanism often fails to acknowledge the irreversible changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution. In an early criticism of writers such as Jane Jacobs, John Dickman contends that they simply edit the factory out of the city and talk about neighborhoods in which the monster of industrialism never intrudes. Dirt and disorder are powdered over, colors and smells are somehow blended as in the artist's palette or the master's cuisine, so that tolerance of their diversity is no affirmation of sensuousness, but is as respectable as a showing in an advanced gallery, or a good dinner in Midtown. Leisure is relaxed and reflective, because security underlies it, and work, with its meaning, is virtually out of sight. To build an urban aesthetic on this caricature of urban life is wholly without meaning for contemporary city planning. A more recent proponent of historicism, Lyon Cryer, would also like to ignore industrialization, which he has described as a total failure, as well as the institutionalized forms of education that evolved along with it, which he has referred to as a tortuous necessity for all, the decisive instrument for social, cultural, and ideological control for social reproduction. As a result, Manuel Castells maintains, although Cryer's typology has a nice appeal, it is reductive and ultimately meaningless. Thomas Dutton likewise observes a wide gulf between Cryer's urban perceptions and prescriptions and contemporary realities, rendering him guilty of misrepresenting the actual relationship between dominant and oppressed cultures, power and powerlessness, urban design and social change. Ultimately, Dutton claims, the realization of Cryer's proposals would only produce superficial change, leaving the city to the reign of dominant institutions with business as usual. The fact that new transportation and communications technologies have subverted the logic of the pre-modern city has also been overlooked in the pursuit of urbanity, as has the impact they have had on reshaping the use and perception of public and private space. Point 2. The danger of this nostalgia is most blatantly manifest in the oversight of the car. As Richard Ingersoll contends, often, in the enthusiasm for a return to the city fabric, the city is treated as if post-industrial times were post-automobile times. Interviewing Colin Rowe, Ingersoll asks, isn't the problem of the automobile, even if it was not the origin of the formal solutions of modernism, still central in a current urban scheme? In a telling response, Rowe admits, here in Rome there are times, in fact every day, when I would prefer to get into an automobile and go shopping in a supermarket than go shopping around in these little stores. The ideal thing would be to have a good American suburb adjacent to a very concentrated Italian town, then you'd have the best of both worlds. Rowe's ideal of living and doing his errands in a well-appointed American suburb with an old European village nearby, for charm, character, and possibly status, is no doubt a widely shared sentiment, albeit rarely admitted by those decrying the decline of the public realm and pursuing the search for urbanity. For although pre-modern typologies and morphologies may appear quaint and may be fun to visit, they usually do not correspond to contemporary needs and tastes. Ingersoll addresses this issue, saying, while the objective of walkable streets and harmonious surroundings might appear to be universal, at the heart of this postmodern alternative lies a troubling paradox that is rarely taken into account and indeed calls into doubt the wisdom of what are essentially formal solutions. Pre-industrial forms and spaces are not necessarily suited to post-industrial ways of life. Ingersoll asks, if one proposes all kinds of nice public spaces, connected streets and figured piazzas, will there still be an audience in a highly technological society for their use? The answer is often no, as attested to by many unused indoor and outdoor public spaces that have been carefully designed and inserted into existing urban fabrics or built in new towns and edge cities. 5. The search for urbanity is misguided when it ignores the contemporary context, such as efforts to build urban architecture regardless of the site, suburban or urban. 6. Testament to the divergent reception of a similar building design in different locations, the poor reception of apartment buildings by Ricardo Bofill's Taller de Architecture in the French new towns of Cergy-Pontoise, Marne-la-Vallée, and Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, and the favorable reception of a similar building in the very urban Montparnasse, where it is coveted by Parisians and adulated by architectural critics. The French architect Roger Biriati, for instance, said that he much prefers Bofill's work at Montparnasse than in the new cities, explaining that it is a question of scale. It is better integrated in Paris where it is surrounded by buildings of the same measurements. American architecture critic Paul Goldberger also detected the location persuasion, excoriating Bofill's new town projects and praising his Parisian work. The search for urbanity is also misguided when it falls into the trap of environmental determinism, presuming that traditional urban forms will engender traditional urban lifestyles. 7. As James Holston has asserted, the problem with forays into contextualism in today's city is paradoxically a question of context. They are out of context in their nostalgic references to social and economic order of the past. Accordingly, the search for urbanity has been accused of placing a brake on the imagination because its fatuous adherence to the forms of the past discourage innovative solutions to the problems of a rapidly changing world. David Mangan maintains that while this new false urbanity may offer some advantages over modern urbanism, it is really about managing mediocrity, since only good designers can create modern architecture, but all architects can work within the frame of urban architecture, which he regards as an architecture of accompaniment. 8. Such management of mediocrity is apparent in the development of Battery Park City on Manhattan's southwestern tip, which New York Times architecture critic Herbert Muschamp described as a corrective to modern urbanism, but a place where the design guidelines inspired by pre-war New York constrained architects from exercising originality. The result, he concludes, is that there isn't one building with something fresh or stimulating to say about urban life today. Another example of urban design that failed to elicit innovative approaches because of its nostalgia is the plan for revitalizing the waterfront of New York City. According to Muschamp, this plan failed to grasp its potential for environmentally sensitive development and for blending nature with the city because it was soaked in the thinking of an earlier day, the industrial age that treated nature mainly as raw material to be exploited for human use. 9. In part an outcome of exhausted creative energies, then, the infatuation with the past further hampers creative potential. Muschamp suggests that this mentality in the world of design generates a climate of indifference to the imagination because it has apparently been decided in advance that every new building should look like the Art Deco apartment buildings of the 1930s. Bishop Crook lampposts should light every street. Every park should look like an Olmsted Park. In addition to ignoring the vast impact of the industrial mode of production and the new technologies it has availed, postmodern urbanism also tends to edit the efforts by urban designers to accommodate these changes as manifest in modern urbanism. Rather than design in the context of modernist settings, postmodern urbanism turns its back on these. Indeed, if it were truly contextual, it would largely be accommodating modernist settings, since these constitute such a large percentage of the landscape the world around. 10 architects and urbanists such as Cryer, Robert Stern, and Quinlan Terry, according to Doug Davis, ignore the specific ideological or religious implications of the periods they quote are in fact anti-historicist. They prefer history as Arcadian symbol, not history as reality. D. Davis, 21. MacLeod similarly criticizes the European typologists Aldo Rossi, Vittorio Gregati, and Rob Cryer for treating architecture primarily as a static artifact, despite their purported interest in history and political transformation. Although they call for contextualism, she says, their proposals are actually couched in a language of universality that views type as a constant in a context of changing productive relations. Ibid. Indeed, their highly personal interpretations of type may reflect a past that may not have existed. The typologists claim that quoting familiar types is reassuring. Yet as Christine Boyer asserts, this can be like walking on a thin tightrope. For decorative pastiches do not necessarily arouse our collective memory. Not unlike the European typologists, Venturi is also guilty of being selectively contextual. As Lesnickowski maintains, Venturi did not address the composition of the examples he described in their contextual totality but picked up fragmentary and secondary aspects to prove his points. His interpretation of the great European mannerisms, says Lesnickowski, was personal, individualistic, detached, isolationist, and formalistic. Ibid. Although certain designers seek a faithful return to the past, most of them justify their more stylized historicisms as intentionally ironic. 11. Like the more generalized ironic response, its manifestation in urban design implies that it is aware of the fictions being applied but acknowledges their necessity. The strategy of double coding proffered by Jenks, for instance, suggests that we use past forms in an ironic way. There is no alternative in our current mass-media inundated world. Yet the denial of contemporary needs and tastes along with the tendency to reject the modern tradition rather than incorporate it have allowed for borrowings from the past which prove misguided and inappropriate. The particular references favored by urban designers are usually selected from their readings and travels on the basis of personal taste and are usually removed from their political and social contexts. Consequently, the meaning designers intend to bestow upon their architecture, so that it communicates, is usually lost. The effort to recenter our decentered world by creating centers offers one example. The Piazza d'Italia, designed by Perez and Associates and Charles Moore, was one effort to develop such a center, but it never became the vibrant public space that its designers had hoped it would be. Highlighting the deadliness of this plaza, Paul Walker Clark points out that it has served as a stage set for 2 movies, both of which portrayed it as empty and with a corpse in the fountain. He contends, the design never overcame the limits of its commission, the false notion that urbanity can be generated by the constitution of an urban center. The recent vogue for townscapes of the past is apparent in movements around the globe for historic preservation, adaptive use, rehabilitation, restoration, and renovation. But in most cases, these attempts to preserve built form are entirely revisionary, for instance, turning houses into museums and old factories into housing. This urban design trend is thus inscribed in the larger trend of inventing traditions, described in Chapter 4.12. In order to make something appear truly old or authentic, it is often necessary to begin anew and to use materials and techniques which were not used for the original. 13. An architect who designed a 17th-century Tuscan villa on Long Island for one client remarked, "We thought of renovating the existing house, but it became clear that to make a house that would look old, we had to start anew." Given the emphasis upon image-making in urban design, developers not surprisingly have looked to the entertainment industries, the masters of Imagineering, particularly for the design of hotels, theme parks, and restaurants. One entertainment executive explained that his company uses fiberglass rather than granite or stone to give the appearance of a rock because you get a very artificial appearance with real rock. The disingenuous nature of these efforts to look effortless and to make the new look old extends to interiors as well, as illustrated by the current predilection among city dwellers for acquiring home furnishings which appear rural and old. To give new things the aged look, a salesperson explained, their paint finishes intentionally show signs of wear and aging. One shop owner explained this sensibility as a nostalgia for the simple life, and another maintained, "I feel that aesthetic is more important than authentic." This desire for an aged patina was also apparent in clothing fashion with the popularity of vintage clothing and worn-in blue jeans. California architect Brian Murphy poignantly commented, "Acid-washed jeans are a perfect metaphor for the perverse postmodern mentality. They take a perfectly good fabric and make it look old." 14. The valorization of artifacts of the industrial era offers one significant example of the way in which the past is revised for current purposes. Since the 1970s, the factories, warehouses, machines, and products of our industrial past have been elevated to preservation status and endowers of social status, as is apparent in museums devoted to displaying items from this period, loft living, the rise of industrial archaeology, and movements for preserving industrial landscapes. The reason that people develop a sentimental, or a sensual, attachment to the industrial aesthetic, says Sharon Zukin, is that it is not real. To be precise, it is no longer real. Robert Harbison maintains that people are choosing to return to a more manageable past. As each generation of machines becomes more complicated, we withdraw into dreams of obsolete machines and see ourselves among windmills, clipper ships, even trolley cars. The smaller our machines become, the more the older, larger ones evoke nostalgia and become part of a common folklore. We are also attracted by the durable quality of things such as reinforced steel shelving in contrast to the built-in obsolescence of so much that has replaced it. 15. While postmodern urbanism has largely overlooked changes set in motion by the factory system, it has at the same time ascribed new meanings to the industrial era by displacing historic artifacts from their original context. Efforts at contextualism and preservation, then, are engaged in inventing a history that largely erases the chapter on the modern period, or revalorizes it and idealizes selected earlier periods. Once the invention of tradition goes beyond a certain point, it produces hyper-real environments which, Umberto Eco explains, must be absolutely fake in order to be better than anything real. The pretense of historicism or preservation, referring to a certain original, is superseded by an attempt to produce an encompassing environment that transcends its source of inspiration. Much of our postmodern landscape has thus been described as hyper-real, particularly master-planned communities, shopping malls, and theme parks or entertainment palaces. The introduction of the magic marker in the 1960s, according to architect Daniel Solomon, contributed to the recasting of American urbanism by magically substituting NPCs for the gridiron town and, in so doing, transforming the landscape of banality of the 1950s into a landscape of metaphor in the 1960s, Mariner's Cove, Tonga Gardens, Briar Heath, broad sunlit uplands. Solomon thus contends, if history was the victim of the first generation of post-war development, reality was the victim of the second. New information technologies have also played an essential role in displacing reality, as they have influenced urban design, the design and building processes, spatial organization, and designers' aesthetic preferences. 16. Although some designers find CAD and GIS constraining and others find it liberating, there is no question that these technologies have contributed to an emphasis on appearance over substance and image over content. 17. The enhanced power of the image introduced by these tools and by other technologies of communication has incited architects and planners to design, more than ever before, with an eye toward getting published. They pay keen attention to how a building appears in a two-dimensional frame. At the same time, architectural publications have altered their formats, pointing out that the insides of buildings are no longer shown in architectural publications, only the exteriors. The French architectural historian Anatole Kopp sarcastically remarked, "Who cares how one is going to live inside? Is it not enough to have provided majestic public spaces, streets and squares? We will be able to take endless walks. We will go everywhere afoot. How wonderful in the Paris or London climate." Magazines that focus on interiors, for their part, rarely include plans or even photographs of building exteriors, bespeaking the growing fragmentation of the design professions. This return of aesthetics is distinct from its earlier incarnation, according to Boyer, because it now features a free play of all styles, with a general quoting, appropriating, recycling of images which suburban tract house design in a Victorian barnyard style, 1990s, Yellow Springs, Ohio easily slide over surface structures. Not NEC. Really referring to any original, what is often produced are simulacra. Such urban design, Boyer maintains, engenders a blasé attitude, for it implies that the city is after all just entertainment, we are only there to look and to buy. The city has become a place of escape, a wonderland that evades reality, for there is nothing more to think about in pure entertainment. There is no outside world, no place from which we feel alienated, for this formalistic city is known and comfortable, it is above all a place to enjoy oneself. The pleasure is affirmative and far from oppositional and negative. With consumption replacing production as the primary economic role of our central cities, Boyer explains, they become places of pure play. Trevor Body describes the product of postmodern urbanism as the analogous city, largely because its urban prosthetics which join towers, shopping centers, and festival marketplaces provide a filtered version of the experience of cities, a simulation of urbanity. By accelerating the stratification of race and class, he says, they degrade the very conditions they supposedly remedy, the amenity, safety, and environmental conditions of the public realm. In theme parks, as well, Harvey observes, it is now possible to experience the world's geography vicariously, as a simulacrum, in a way which conceals almost perfectly any trace of origin, of the labor processes that produced them or of the social relations implicated in their production. In a contemporary, and somehow unnerving, twist, these simulacra have become reality since many more people visit the simulacra of Africa and China presented in Disney World than actually visit these foreign lands and, for them, the simulacra are Africa and China more than the far-off places themselves. 18 The emphasis on appearance has translated into the favoring of building facades that disguise the authentic materials, scale, history, and purpose. This is usually done in an effort to maintain or generate a sense of urbanity or tradition. Rather than reveal the true structure of a building, facades are often designed to make large buildings look like a number of smaller ones, to be decorative, or to make new construction look old. Thus, our cities today contain many examples of pre-war facades, a term popularized by the real estate industry, usually referring to World War I and sometimes World War II. Pre-war-styled townhouses, mansions, shops, and factories mask what are actually late 20th century luxury condominiums, hotels, retail stores, cultural institutions, sports arenas, and corporate office buildings. The new typology of festival marketplaces appearing in central cities since 1972 joins a variety of commercial uses in a rehabilitated pre-war building or a new building designed in the spirit of the old. Such design has been described disparagingly as facadism or facadomi. A New York Times editorial asserted, "Modern America has turned facades inside out. Small masks big. Old masks new. Elegant modesty disguises graceless pretension." Postmodern architectural theory and criticism have similarly been accused of facadism for their tendency to proffer analyses based solely on the formal aspects of buildings, and to obfuscate rather than clarify. Point 19 This move toward playing with facades and appearances generally reacted to the over-serious corporate character of modern urban design, which ignored people's emotional needs and which led a number of urban designers to assert that form should follow fiction rather than function. 20 Jacobs and Appleyard, for instance, complained that architects and planners take cities and themselves too seriously. The result too often is deadliness and boredom, no imagination, no humor, alienating places. But people need an escape from the seriousness and meaning of the everyday. One should not have to travel as far as the Himalayas or the South Sea Islands to stretch one's experience. Such challenges could be nearer home. There should be a place for community utopias, for historic, natural, and anthropological evocations of the modern city, for encounters with the truly exotic. While invented tradition and hyper-real environments often offer an antidote to modernism's insularity, they can also devolve into bad taste, or kitsch, in their sentimental references to something else. 21 Most urban designers no longer seek to destroy the city, Patrice Noviant argues, but their objective is still not the real city. Instead, he observes, it is what one might call the kitsch city, by which is understood the false city, more beautiful than real, that which is aspired to as a certain comfortable level of false consciousness. According to Scott Lash, postmodern architecture exemplifies dedifferentiation in contrast to the modernist grounding in differentiation of signifiers from signified. 22 But, he maintains, the signified or meaning that postmodern architecture signifiers latch onto is substanceless and dissolves into a vacuum of kitsch. 23 With regard to postmodernism more generally, Mestrovik remarked that postmodern themes of impulse, play, fun, and fantasy are shallow, kitsch imitations of genuine compassion and emotionality expressed by the Romantics. 24 In addition, the dogged subjectivism of certain urban designers can distract them from the actual program in their search for a fantasy world, the illusory high that takes us beyond current realities into pure imagination. Harvey muses, it is, perhaps, appropriate that the postmodernist developer building, as solid as the pink granite of Philip Johnson's 810T building, should be debt-financed, built on the basis of fictitious capital, and architecturally conceived of, at least on the outside, ing to Marx's admonition that history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Boyer contends that the current rescue of history from the warehouse of society can be a farce. On the one hand, she maintains, we often have historic preservation that looks like a near equivalent to stage designing or an emotional remembrance of a nostalgic past, and on the other hand postmodernism turns toward a past without any idea of how to use it. FORMFOLLOWSFEAR As the public realm has been growing increasingly impoverished, there has been a corresponding decline in meaningful public space and desire to control one's space, or to privatize. 25. From a place that once combined production, consumption, and social interaction, public space has become compartmentalized. The social aspects of the street, for instance, have been suppressed over time in favor of movement. And as public space has been transforming, so have private space and the relationship between them. The privatization impulse is epitomized by the exponential growth in the West in the number of households living in individual houses, as well as in gated communities. As meaningful public space diminishes, private space, the home, has become increasingly important. 26. The French philosopher Jérôme Bind interprets the widespread desire to live in an individual house as the postmodern moment where everyone is returned to himself. To his little games, to the scenery of his daily life, to his narcissistic anxiety of being liberated. The individuals of societies in crisis, disoriented by the sudden devaluation of unanimous credos, become thus refugees in a rediscovered opium in this padlocked garden where one would like to forget the snubs insults of real history. The clear spatial and social distinction provided by the gated community replaces the former distinction of vertical segregation and substitutes horizontal for vertical segregation. The number and size of these socially homogeneous ghettos has expanded along with America's road network. This marked social segregation allows a certain ignorance, and therefore fears, regarding social differences, as well as the generation of myths, stereotypes, and stigmas associated with the other. 27. The privatization impulse is also manifest in the appropriation of public spaces by private agencies. For example, the inward-turning shopping mall which has abandoned the central city for the suburbs and which turns its back entirely on its surroundings with its fortress-like exterior surrounded by a moat-like parking lot, the indoor atriums of corporate office buildings, the proliferation of theme parks in which Main Street and other recognizable features of the past are reproduced at a miniaturized 7/8 scale, scrubbed clean of their real contexts, and commercialized. And the expansion of franchises and chain stores which offer consumers familiarity wherever they may be. Although the office and retail towers, shopping malls, theme parks, and central city mixed-use megastructures of postmodern urbanism provide new public spaces, entry and behavior are tightly restricted. City Walk in Universal City, Los Angeles, designed by the Jerd Partnership City Walk Code of Conduct, Universal City, Los Angeles through sophisticated security systems, signage, and the design itself, leading Mike Davis to call them pseudo-public spaces. The compromised nature of these ostensibly public spaces is well illustrated by the sign posted at the entry to Universal Studios' new theme park, City Walk, neither a city nor a place to which anyone can walk, which warns visitors against, among other things, obscene language or gestures, noisy or boisterous behavior, singing, playing of musical instruments, unnecessary staring, running, skating, rollerblading, bringing pets, non-commercial expressive activity, distributing commercial advertising, failing to be fully clothed, or sitting on the ground more than 5 minutes. In all of these more recent forms of public space, participation is largely single-focused and almost always consumer-oriented, limited to those with the ability to purchase. Older public spaces have also been appropriated and controlled through increased gating, signage designating who should be using the space and when, the expansion of curfews and police sweeps in transportation terminals and parks, the expansion of the public police force, the increased use of private police forces, and the pronounced anti-growth mentality. While certain parks, plazas, and commons remain places to escape from loci of production and consumption, their traditional social component is invariably circumscribed because the rising tide of fear has transformed them into controlled and guarded places, usually with curfews and/or gates and not accessible to all. These so-called public spaces, then, are places of exclusion as well as inclusion. The apotheosis of this escapist and exclusionary urbanism is found in the proliferation of edge cities during the 1980s, an abnegation of the central city and the unique quality of life it promised. Grassroots measures to secure property often make little pretense to create vibrant public spaces as demonstrated, for instance, by the sprinkler systems used by shop owners to keep the homeless from sleeping nearby and the muzak used by 7-Eleven stores to keep teenagers from hanging out. The rebuilding of shops after the 1992 Los Angeles uprising has taken defensive urbanism to its extreme. As Flusty recounts, wood frame structures, flammable and easily breached, have been replaced by single or double-thick walls of concrete masonry. Parapets have been extended to deflect firebombs thrown from street level. Display windows have been either omitted or set into concrete bulwarks 2 to 5 feet above sidewalk level to prevent automobiles ramming through to the interior. Locking glazed entries and steel lattice sliding burglar doors have been replaced with solid metal plate roll-down gates, many pre-graffiti to discourage taggers. The panopticon, and its successive refinements, offer a literal and figurative model for understanding this evolution. As Foucault posits, evolving technologies of power serve to maintain the status quo. From the 17th and 18th century political rationality of raison d'etat, he maintains, biopower began to inform the disciplinary technologies employed by elites, and for the exercise of biopower, visibility was essential. Spectacles of terror and punishment as well as those of patronage and benevolence acted as a kind of natural policing. By the 19th century, this visibility was enhanced by the redevelopment of European cities with long, wide straight boulevards and strategically placed monuments and housing for the bourgeoisie. As disciplinary strategies have been progressively refined to the present, visibility of the ruled has continued to increase, but that of the rulers has decreased. This is because, as Foucault remarks, power is tolerable only on condition that it mask a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms. As the expression and exercise of power has become less and less visible over the last few centuries, its influence is more difficult to discern. And it is more difficult to resist. Whereas the plaza, or place, was the quintessential public space until the 19th century, today's placelessness renders the exercise of power more elusive. It is everywhere and nowhere, assumed ubiquitous, or alternatively, assumed absent. One example of disciplinary regional planning is offered by the splintering of the Parisian University in the wake of the student uprisings of May 1968. The university was not only factioned into many smaller ones, but these were located outside of the central city and designed to incorporate little or no public space for spontaneous or even planned student gatherings. Another example found in France was the building of 5 new cities in the outer suburbs of Paris to house the working class of the city and to de-densify the inner suburbs, and thereby mollify their revolutionary tendencies. A parallel example, though this time undertaken by the private sector, was the exodus by many U.S. corporate headquarters from central cities to more controlled and less costly suburban office parks or corporate campuses, as well as the edge cities of which they form an integral part. Disciplinary space is also encountered on the smaller scale in, for instance, atrium buildings, which could be regarded as evolved heirs to Bentham's panopticon, where the center is now occupied by a void rather than a supervisor. To take the example of New York University's Bob's Library, designed by Philip Johnson in 1972, the void serves to discourage unsanctioned behavior by library users, whether the stealing and abuse of books or physical assault. The historically disciplinary supervisor is rendered superfluous. Library users have become their own guardians. This protective strategy is less blatant than the earlier ones, as are its agents. Is it the architect, his client, or our fellow library users who are exercising the control? The wielding of power today, then, is disguised and difficult to identify because it is not localized and often not personalized, because its agents are rarely self-aware, because it is internalized to a great extent, and because it therefore goes largely unnoticed. Jürgen Habermas has observed, the distortions within such a regulated, analyzed, controlled, and watched-over life world are certainly more subtle than the obvious forms of material exploitation and impoverishment, but are no less destructive for all that. As the exercise of power grows more disguised and anonymous, agency becomes confused and people, unwittingly, become terrorists as well as terrorized. In the end, a growing perception of greater equality among people both nationwide and worldwide, plied largely by the various mass media, accompanies and legitimizes growing inequalities. The contemporary built environment offers a dwindling supply of meaningful public space, and that which exists is increasingly controlled by various forms of surveillance and increasingly invested with private meanings. 28 activities that once occurred in the public realm have either been abandoned or usurped by more private realms, as leisure, entertainment, gaining information, and consumption are increasingly satisfied at home with the television or computer. Or if one leaves home, these activities often take place in the strictly controlled unifunctional settings of the shopping mall, theme park, or variants thereof. Describing this condition, Jacobs and Appleyard noted that cities have become privatized, partly because of the consumer society's emphasis on the individual and the private sector, but escalated greatly by the spread of the automobile. Crime in the streets is both a cause and a consequence of this trend, which has resulted in a new form of city, one of closed, defended islands with blank and windowless facades surrounded by wastelands of parking lots and fast-moving traffic. As public transit systems have declined, the number of places in American cities where people of different social groups actually meet each other has dwindled. The public environment of many American cities has become an empty desert, leaving public life dependent for its survival solely on planned formal occasions, mostly in protected internal locations. Fear has led social groups to flee from each other into homogeneous social enclaves. It is an alien world for most people. It is little surprise that most withdraw from community involvement to enjoy their own private and limited worlds. Now more than a generation after the seminal works of Jane Jacobs and Chermaif and Alexander, 30, the rising tide of fear and privatization has continued to inspire efforts among urban design professionals to assuage feelings of fear through design. 31 such efforts are found on the left in the name of egalitarianism and on the right as a means of social control. Pinpointing the decline of meaningful public space and of the clear distinction between private and public space as the source of much contemporary fear, many postmodern urban design strategies focus on reconstituting these. Usually, such strategies involve combining the familiarity and human scale of traditional spaces with the benefits of contemporary technologies. The illegible quality of post-World War II urban development and the fear this generated also incited a concern for creating legible landscapes. A prevalent postmodern urban design strategy has been to enclose public space, as opposed to the modernist tendency to place buildings within public space. 32 Many urban designers have been attempting to recreate the physical and dimensional relationship between public and private space that existed in pre-industrial townscapes. These efforts focus on producing settings that appear to have evolved spontaneously over time and that encourage inhabitants naturally to appropriate spaces. 33 Efforts to emulate pre-industrial colonial or medieval cities are apparent on a smaller scale in designs for shopping districts, theme parks, and other public or semi-public spaces. A number of urban design initiatives have experimented with the design of public space. One of these is found in the town of Val d'Hyères, built in 1965 for a population of 30,000. In an effort to prevent social unrest, the public-private developer of this town decided to create a public space between a middle-income neighborhood of individual houses and a lower-income neighborhood of subsidized apartments. According to Manuel Castells, most residents reacted with hostility. The homeowners of Épinay-Saint-Honart petitioned to have their open space enclosed and separated, so that the children of the public housing units could not play with theirs. Immigrant families faced open racism, expressed through complaints against their smoky cooking and their noisy chatting. Youths were blamed for every possible mishap, and by 1972-73 many residents were asking for permits to own handguns as well as an increased police presence. Various demonstrations took place from 1972 to 1974, and although the local police records did not indicate a significant increase in crime, a general feeling of insecurity prevailed. 34 Historicism can be interpreted as an attempt to deny change rather than to adapt to it, because of the prevalence of fear and anxiety in postmodern society. 35 Supporting this contention, Huxtable interprets the recreation of main streets in theme parks, saying, Main Street USA is created even as main streets die across the country. Historicism can also be interpreted as an expression of nostalgia for an authoritarian past. In this vein, Doug Davis highlights the similarities between the contemporary appeal for classical architecture and the cultural literacy campaign, as well as the spate of apocalyptic neoconservative crisis literature, Daniel Bell, Christopher Lasch, Robert Bella et al. All of these bemoan the deterioration of order in post-industrial societies and usually invoke a return to some idealized past or to a certain morality or canon. As Margaret Crawford suggests, the shift to classicist references could bespeak an effort by the architectural profession to acquire the trappings of prestige necessary to distance itself from more pragmatically oriented professional groups. We must question the validity of referring back to an architecture which was built by and sustained a tyrannical elite, even when there is an attempt to subvert this order by, for instance, applying such references to the design of public housing. Apropos, Kenneth Frampton questions the appropriateness of Ricardo Bofill public housing complexes in France, comprising standard apartments which are willfully encased in false architraves and empty columns. Deprived of a terrace, since this does not accord with the assumed syntax, the upwardly mobile resident has to be satisfied with the operatic illusion of living in a palace. Leon Cryer is not oblivious to the political and manipulative intentions lurking beneath architectural styles, contending, classical architecture has been the noblest instrument of politics and of civilizing propaganda for thousands of years and throughout all great cultures and continents. While Cryer regards this as one of its assets, others regard such urban design strategies as reactionary. Davis points out, the assumption that the obsessively symmetrical classical language once taught to upper-class schoolboys in England is universal in its appeal to a multiracial world is xenophobic. D. Davis, 19. Although appropriate for universities in late 19th and early 20th century America, when Republican ideals were popular, Rosemary Bletter suggests that neoclassicism's inflexibility renders it inappropriate for most other uses. Referring to its reemergence in the United States in the early 1980s as the Ronald Reagan style, Bletter maintains that the pretense to monumentality usually ends up mocking whatever it is used for. Another outcome of recreating such landscapes today may be to buttress, or exacerbate, contemporary social inequalities. 36 Although postmodern historical eclecticism, regionalism, and preservation are justified as expressions of pluralism or multiculturalism, the modern version's imperialistic subtext is certainly latent as well, if not manifest. A number of recent efforts can be seen to resemble, for instance, the building of new cities in the French colonies from 1900 to the 1930s. The French technocrats responsible for the design of these new cities were trying to modernize without eradicating the local character of the colonies by applying strict building codes and design reviews. This strategy was intended to preserve the native society in such a way as to ensure French dominance over it and to offer the French a picturesque and exotic environment for their pleasure. It would also prevent or discourage the local society from evolving and, in the process, imply that its members were only of value in this museum-ified fashion. In actuality, the French intervention was destroying the local economies, increasing the gap between rich and poor, and alienating the indigenous populations from their cultural traditions. And by keeping the local culture unmodern, the French technocrats could ensure its dependence upon French services, markets, and technologies. 37 In its postmodern manifestation, the effort to respect differences and to design with regards to regional contexts can additionally become a style, which defeats its very purpose of being anti-universalist and preserving distinction. As Stephen Connor asserts, when hybridization itself becomes universal, regional specificity becomes simply a style which can be transmitted across the globe as rapidly as a photocopy of the latest glossy architectural manifesto. Paradoxically, the sign of the success of the anti-universalist language and style of architectural postmodernism is that one can find it everywhere, from London, to New York, to Tokyo and Delhi. 38 And needless to say, it fails to achieve its putative intent of celebrating pluralism. 39 When that which is being preserved is nature, a Christian Puritan morality can enter the picture, a morality which sees bodily pleasure and experience as amoral and which calls for the preservation of one's honor. This impulse bemoans the defiling of Mother Nature by the penetration of virgin countryside with man-made technologies, the worst-case scenario being the skyscraper. The following reaction of Thomas Sharp in 1932 to the prospect of town expansion exemplifies this impulse: the strong, masculine virility of the town, the softer beauty, the richness, the fruitfulness of that mother of men, the countryside, will be debased into one sterile, hermaphrodite beastliness. This may be understood as a reflex, not among those whose honor is to be preserved, but among those who wish to deny others what they themselves already have and who wish to retain pockets of unspoiled nature or folklore for their own enjoyment and for maintaining their hegemonic position by preventing others from access to the same opportunities. Movements to preserve nature or wildlife may be thinly veiled attempts to preserve the intimacy of one's community as well as land values, such as anti-growth sentiments and NIMBYism. The oft-applied phrases adaptive reuse and the search for a usable past are revealing. Indeed, postmodern urbanism often appears to use the past for present purposes, which have to do with imperialistic motives as well as with profit-making and the personal recognition of the designer or client. Holston has pointed out that the modernist aesthetic of erasure and reinscription is often criticized for masking realities and colluding with certain governments in their attempts to rewrite national histories. In similar fashion, the architecture and planning of the last 2 decades may be criticized for denying contemporary realities and for rewriting history, excluding that which it wishes to be forgotten, or for being Stalinian. 40 Like the 18th century picturesque, to which it often refers, it can be accused of complacency, of regarding landscape as something separate from and opposed to human society, its imagery to obscure social and economic issues. 41 Modern fear and the scientific climate in which it occurred led to efforts to cope with it through rational understanding and shaping the future. Prevalent responses to postmodern fear, amidst the reigning anti-technocratic climate, are nostalgia and attempts by designers to provide legible environments that are meaningful to their constituencies by referring to a certain context or to mass imagery. Are these efforts achieving their goals, particularly that of diminishing danger and providing a sense of security? Or does the concerted effort to plan for spontaneity, to invent traditions, to design in the vernacular, and to generate hyper-real environments subvert this intent? The answer is not clear-cut. Certainly gated communities, policing, and other surveillance systems, defensive architecture, and neo-traditional urbanism contribute to giving people a greater sense of security. 42 But such settings no doubt also contribute to accentuating fear by increasing paranoia and distrust. In addition, the escapist nature of neo-traditionalist urban design may emit signals that the present is too unsavory, let's pretend it's not here and go back to the good old days. Such reluctance to embrace the present and happily anticipate the future inevitably contributes to an atmosphere of foreboding which casts a pall upon the quality of life at all levels, from the most public to the most intimate. FORMFOLLOWSFINESSE In Search of Meaning, one direction in which architecture and planning theory turned was toward the systematic study of signs, or semiology, an outgrowth of structural linguistics. This turn injected a welcome dose of concern with the symbolic meanings of architecture and with context, content, and substance, rather than solely with style. But recourse to semiology and linguistics led to a theoretical impasse and was criticized for being misguided, pretentious at best, and a distraction from more important issues at worst. Tom Wolfe, for instance, described the current fashion of discussing architecture in the terminology of linguistics solemn nonsense, saying it is mainly euphemism used to avoid such sensitive subjects as class, status, and the priestly ambition of the architect when it isn't sheer brain fill or an attempt to disguise the architect's real project of making architecture about architecture and of standing out in the crowd. 42 Though provocative, the inaccessibility of semiological and linguistic theory and the difficulties in applying it to urban design ultimately obfuscated issues more than it clarified them, and failed to produce a usable urban design theory. Having grown disillusioned with the idealism of modernism and with the possibilities for semiology, there was a turning inward in the urban design professions, paralleling that in society at large. As Wojciech Lesnikowski contends, instead of speaking of any ideology or group approaches, architects started discussing their works in terms of their own attitudes and indulged in extreme individualism. 43 The French architect Alain Guillou observed, from an architect supposedly giving to others, we have moved in a very short space of time to the artist-architect who speaks of himself, of his own genius. 44 And Huxtable exclaimed, the most fundamental change in architecture today is one of attitude. Scratch a postmodernist and you will find an apostle of architecture for art's sake, something that would have had any respectable and responsible architect drummed out of the profession not too long ago. With the renunciation of traditional social responsibilities as beyond his capacities or control, the architect has finally been freed to pursue style exclusively and openly, without apology or disguise. 45 She bemoaned the current state of design as having more pettiness and pedantry than passion in architecture today. There are no heroes, and no architectural giants, because there are no causes. Alexander Sonis and Leanne Lefevre referred to this tendency as narcissistic, suggesting an active regression due to acute frustration with the prevalent urban design approaches of the 1960s. In reaction to the naive attitudes of scientism and populism, they contended, this narcissistic turn disregards or denies context entirely and features instead a preoccupation with the purely visual features of architecture, a fascination with the evocative power of drawings and models, a tendency to view design solely as an object of gratification, the conviction that the architect is the supreme judge of the quality of the built environment, and the rejection of the functionalist aesthetic as well as the very idea of function itself. Venturi warned against such a tendency. An architecture of complexity and contradiction does not mean picturesqueness or subjective expressionism. A false complexity has recently countered the false simplicity of an earlier modern architecture. It represents a new formalism as unconnected with experience as the former cult of simplicity. 46 Once again, the emphasis was on surface rather than substance, or aesthetic rather than authentic, but this time it reflected a turning inward rather than an effort to be playful or protective. And like the tendencies to follow fiction or fear, this false complexity contributed to masking the shortcomings of postmodern urbanism as well as its social and political settings. 47 Postmodern urbanism's resurrection of the street, avenue, boulevard, park, plaza, and square offers another example of insufficiently considering the context. These rhetorical changes do not always translate into formal ones, and even when they do not always translate into changes in function and perception. This is because the circumstances in which urban design is occurring have moved ahead, not backwards. These circumstances, including social relations of production, techniques, materials, and post-industrial lifestyles, usually foil any effort to hark back to pre-industrial towns or effect only skin-deep changes. This has incited one critic to regard postmodern urban interventions as Ville's radiuses in medieval and Baroque garb. One outcome of the failure of postmodern urbanism to adequately consider the contemporary political economy was demonstrated in the building of False Creek, a self-conscious attempt to build a postmodern landscape in the 1970s within the city of Vancouver, Canada. For the building of this new community, David Lay maintains, there was an unusually direct transfer of current social science and design theory to the built environment, including Herbert Ganza's ideas about social diversity in urban villages, Jane Jacobs's For Generators of Diversity, J. Jacobs 1961, Christopher Alexander's Pattern Language and Participatory Design Process, and Ian McHarg's view of ecological harmony in design. In an effort to humanize the city and to make it livable, planners applied historical, vernacular, and regional allusions and devised a plan with an orientation toward the picturesque. It was a conscious reaction against unimaginative urban design, and nothing was left to chance. Even street names would evoke continuity rather than transience. At False Creek, there was to be a mixing of lifestyles and tenure types, and the income mix was to reflect the metropolitan area with approximately one-third low income, one-third middle income, and one-third high income. 48 The problem with this livable city strategy, however, was that it inflated housing demand while the policy of low-density housing and the resistance of private developers to invest in lower-profit development limited housing supply. Consequently, land prices skyrocketed, doubling from 1972 to 1974, and by 1978, 25% of the city's households were spending excessive amounts on housing. In sum, action stemming from liberal ideology disfavored a vulnerable income group and favored the more privileged, and the development boom followed by an economic downturn exposed this weakness with a vengeance. Lay thus concludes, a livable city ideology and an ideology of equity are only coincidental in special cases where economic strength is assured, public intervention is active, and private interests are constrained. By the same token, efforts by architects and planners to involve their constituencies in the design process have suffered from an insufficient consideration of political and economic constraints as well as of the structural position of the architect or planner vis-a-vis the people. These efforts, which were particularly widespread during the 1960s and 1970s, included social planning, participatory design, community architecture, advocacy planning, and self-help. Architects and planners discovered that if they chose to give clients what they wanted, the task of understanding and satisfying the needs and desires of a diverse population proved daunting. They were relinquishing their creative role along with its possibilities for enhancing the social and physical landscapes, and they became pawns in a larger political economy which they may not support. Though intending to subvert the traditional mode of architectural production and thereby serve as a springboard for changing other aspects of society, these architects and planners discovered that the acquisition of home, especially if one identifies with it, accelerates the privatization of self and intensifies conformist behavior and a passive attitude toward efforts that affect general social issues. Rather than politicize their participants, these projects tended to play a socialization role in preparing the user for a consumer society. Crawford describes how the efforts of these radical architects and planners were misdirected, saying that they unwittingly replaced modernism's welfare state with a marketplace, in which, unfortunately, their ideal client did not have the means to purchase architectural services. Crawford, 39. Their critique of modernism, Crawford discerns, ended up emphasizing the marketplace of taste and allowing the dominant economic tendencies to become the final arbiter of what gets built. John Turner's work, for instance, has been accused of representing nothing less than the now traditional attempts of capitalist interests to palliate the housing shortage in ways that do not interfere with the effective operation of these interests. 49 Even attempts to consider the local context of design intervention without actual input from the local community has usually exceeded the grasp of urban designers. 50 In the final analysis, such undertakings have proven relatively expensive to realize, largely unable to reach those intended, and although found mainly on the political left, guilty of colluding with uneven development and other injustices of the capitalist system rather than resisting or subverting these. Although leaving their imprints on theory and practice as well as on the landscape, these experiments have had little success owing to resistance from within the profession as well as from local communities. Both the modernist and postmodernist efforts at populism, then, ultimately ended up succumbing to market forces and pandering to the rich rather than serving the public good. Peter Eisenman expressed this view, remarking that participatory architecture makes for an elitist fantasy masquerading as a populist game. Recoiling from these populist efforts, many architects and planners concluded that they were casting their net too wide and should return to focusing solely on buildings and physical planning. The attempt by professional architects and planners to become politically engaged and to treat urban problems holistically by drawing from the social sciences was thus in large part supplanted by a more insular and apolitical approach. 51 Featuring an emphasis on aesthetics. The postmodernist re-emphasis on aesthetics is often explained as a reaction to the modernist neglect of aesthetic issues for the sake of political ones. From a social architecture designed to resolve collective problems, postmodernism shifted to concerns that are less politically ambitious and more cosmetic and symbolic. 52 Indeed, the vociferous political agenda of the modern movement is often countered by extreme apoliticism among postmodern urbanists, with designers emphasizing the limits of changing society through architecture. 53 Whereas modern urbanism included a political stance critical of the unregulated capitalist economy, private property, and inegalitarian class relations, postmodern urbanism tends to regard these issues as outside the line of duty and sometimes even to champion them. Because of the decline of modernist ideals, those few designers who carry the modern torch and retain an emancipatory vision tend to be ridiculed, particularly in the United States. Proposals for buildings without ornament or for towers in a park rather than pre-industrial-looking townscapes are often condemned as fascistic. And in the few instances where an idealistic desire to make a better world persists, the ability to do so is diminished because of the fragmentation and thoroughly transnational nature of power. FORMFOLLOWSFINANCE The apoliticism of contemporary urban designers has impelled critics to accuse them of being anti-avant-gardist or rearguardist. 54 Since urban design interventions invariably have an impact on people's lives, however, the work of urban designers is inevitably political whether or not they choose to be politically engaged. But the denial of urban design's political component 55 contributes to exacerbate existing inequalities, one of these being Euro-American hegemony. 56 Paul Walker Clark, for instance, contends that postmodernism's claim to embrace history, respect context, endorse popular forms of culture, and elaborate vernacular typologies raises certain questions. Whose history? Whose notion of context? Whose vernacular? Whose popular culture? Left unaddressed, he asserts, history is objectified by an architectural or technocratic elite. 57 Ultimately, the retreat from a political agenda into the invention of histories, the production of hyper-real environments, and subjectivism usually ends up accentuating the banes of capitalist urban development rather than checking its excesses. Not part of the solution, designers become part of the problem. Rather than bring historical forms and concepts to contextualize current issues, Mark Yerzombeck observes, the contemporary brand of historicism favors an uncritical alliance with mass culture that wants to neutralize history so that it doesn't threaten the day-to-day working of the world of marketing. 58 Although the collage may in theory allow for a kind of popular participation by offering a double reading, it does so, as Harvey points out, at the price of a certain incoherence or, more problematic, vulnerability to mass-market manipulation. Rather than inform the present, then, the contemporary uses of contextualism in urban design often appear to mystify it. Likewise, the so-called search for urbanity may be regarded as a smokescreen for the growing gap between the rich and the poor. As the French architect Claude Parent writes, the discussion about the city is a distraction, in the strong sense of the term. It is a manipulation of minds. We are camouflaging pauperization, it is extraordinary and insulting. It is propaganda in its pure state. This is also evident in the new typology of the festival marketplace, which Harvey has described as an institutionalized commercialization of a more or less permanent spectacle, since its emphasis on architecture as theater or spectacle is a deflection from dealing with other problems. This typology gives the public bread and circuses, as did Roman leaders during the decline of their empire, in an effort to compete favorably against other cities and to distract the populace from their own corruption and other pressing issues. Finally, this is apparent in the gentrification and concurrent growth in homelessness since the 1970s, as well as in the growth of edge cities during the 1980s, all symptoms and symbols of the growing gap between the rich and the poor. 59 Instead of harnessing the potential of the first machine age, Martin Pauly contends, the second machine age has substituted a fascination with images for ideology and social concerns, as architects have succumbed to the ever-growing power of the mass media. 60 With the emergence of hyperrealities, Jean Baudrillard claims, architecture became a monument to advertising rather than to public space. 61 Frampton notes that in learning from Las Vegas, Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisner are brought to concede the superfluity of architectural design in a society that is exclusively motivated by ruthless economic drives, a society which has nothing of greater significance to represent than the giant neon-lit sky sign of the average strip. He contends that the cult of the ugly and the ordinary becomes indistinguishable from the environmental consequences of the market economy. 62 This elevation of images over ideology has allowed an unprecedented complicity with the marketplace. Architecture, Barry Bergdahl remarks, has become a booming subsidiary of the fashion market. Frampton observes that today the division of labor and the imperatives of monopolized economy are such as to reduce the practice of architecture to large-scale packaging. At its most predetermined, postmodernism reduces architecture to a condition in which the package deal arranged by the builder-developer determines the carcass and the essential substance of the work, while the architect is reduced to contributing a suitably seductive mask. 63 The Walt Disney Company perhaps best epitomizes the commercialization of architecture in commissioning 20 well-known architects. According to Patricia Lee Brown, Disney cannily figured out that architecture itself was undergoing a vast change in the last decade, a change that could dovetail perfectly with Disney's corporate needs. One of the selected architects, Robert Stern, remarked that Michael Eisner sensed architects were hot. As architecture has become increasingly concerned with image and entertaining, so the general public has become more interested in architecture. Brown declared that it is not only that Disney has come closer to the mainstream of architecture, it is also that the mainstream of architecture has become more like Disney. It is in Disney that the worlds of architecture and entertainment, which have been moving closer to each other for years, have achieved their most powerful intersection yet, becoming so intimately intertwined that it is sometimes impossible to tell any longer which is which. This subjugation of urban design to market forces was certainly present in modern urbanism and largely spelled the demise of its political agenda. But these forces have grown ever stronger since the 1970s with the acceleration of change, featuring the emergence of flexible accumulation, the rise of cities supported by global economies, and second-tier cities, the corporatization of the architectural profession, heightened competition among firms, and the related concern among consumers to achieve distinction while simultaneously investing money prudently in objects with resale potential, which look solid or traditional. These conditions have combined to render norms and ideals virtually unthinkable. 64 Ushering in apoliticism along with a decline in creativity. Theresult. A principal feature of postmodern urbanism is contextualism, in contrast to modern urbanism's break from the past and the site. When contextualism is achieved in urban design, it is usually appreciated unless somehow inappropriate or regarded by the users as a patronizing gesture. In most cases, however, contextualism is not achieved because of economic and political constraints, the invention of histories, shortcomings of urban designers, and other reasons. In short, these goals usually prove elusive owing to urban designers' ironic failure to acknowledge the larger contexts in which they build. When contextualism is not achieved, the urban design initiative is usually not appreciated, except in certain instances where people believe a place is historically, physically, or socially contextual or don't care because the place succeeds for other reasons such as the standard of living it offers, its prestige, and/or its location. The contextual attempts to gain inspiration from the site, the social context, and mass culture have more in common with attempts to gain inspiration from the past than may initially appear to be the case. Indeed, they converge where urban design draws from a fictionalized and media-massaged past or vernacular. 65 Like the historicist tendency, these others betray a sense of insecurity and/or confusion and suggest a desire for self-affirmation, self-expression, self-discovery, and rootedness. And like historicism, these efforts also tend to be more rhetorical than real, largely because their premises contain denials and because the formulation and implementation of these agendas by elites subvert their initial claims. We might say that postmodern urban form follows fiction, finesse, fear, and finance as well as function. But then so did modern urban form. Ultimately, despite its efforts to counter the negative aspects of modern urbanism, postmodern urbanism falls into many of the same traps. Despite its eagerness to counter the human insensitivity of modern urbanism, postmodern urbanism's preoccupation with surface treatments and irony makes it equally guilty of neglecting the human component. By denying transformations that have taken place, postmodern urbanism may even be accentuating the most criticized elements of modern urbanism such as the emphasis on formal considerations and elitism. Ingersoll has asserted, to project a return to a traditional city and with it a future of neo-villagers may be more of a fantasy than any science fiction vision of a society dominated by robots. If the urban process is confined to aesthetic criteria alone, the social consequences, such as the elimination of emancipatory demands from the urban program, may be as unpleasant as those wrought by the functionalist fallacies of the post-war period. It is as if urbs, the bound city form of the past, could be considered without civitas, the social agreement to share that lost urban promised land. 66 As Clarke has said, although its agenda suggests an antithesis, postmodernism has a legacy from modernism it has yet to contradict. Although architects may no longer be talking of the unadorned cube as the aesthetic model, he contends, their works are still divorced from the larger context, particularly social, in which they are situated. Although this style may look different on the surface, it is just as fragmented as what it pretends to be criticizing, because flexible accumulation favors urban design interventions which distinguish themselves, thereby mitigating against contextualism. 67 The modernist refusal to acknowledge context, as epitomized in the reflecting glass wall, might be interpreted as a refusal to acknowledge the emergent mass culture and culture of consumption. 68 But postmodern urbanism's continued denial of the conditions of a mass society, despite its efforts to acknowledge them through contextualism, merely exacerbates the problems of modern urbanism. This denial is epitomized by certain postmodernists' refusal to build any physical structure or place, only to design or theorize. Although justified as a form of resistance, this informed choice only perpetuates the conditions they oppose. ONBALANCE. While much ink has been spilled on pronouncing the banes of postmodern urbanism, there is also widespread sentiment that it offers a number of correctives to that which preceded it. Indeed, Ralph has suggested that these reactions to modern urbanism have ushered in a quiet revolution in how cities are made and maintained, with the result that repressive architecture and planning by great corporate or government bureaucracies is being replaced by more sensitive and varied alternatives. Although historicism can be essentially elitist, esoteric, and distant and can devolve into kitsch, it can also provide a sense of security and rootedness when judiciously applied, as in the reconstruction of European central cities. The potentially creative component of borrowing from the past is suggested by folklorist Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, who maintains that traditionalizing or restoring, Kirschenblatt-Gimblett, 208, is a universal behavior which entails a process of giving form and meaning by referring to something old while creating new contexts, audiences, and meanings for the forms. 69 other contextualisms have also succeeded to some extent in achieving an urbanism that is meaningful to more people. Efforts to design in a physically contextual manner have, for the most part, been an antidote to the modernist emphasis on the architectural object and disregard for the site. Its close cousin, regionalism, has also proven to be a welcome departure from the high modernist contempt for existing styles, even though, like historicism, it may appear as a caricatured, mass-produced travesty of the regional context, and/or a neo-colonialist undertaking, by developers, technocrats, and urban designers, to prevent the natives from becoming more cosmopolitan. Residential design in postmodern urbanism offers certain advantages over that of modernism. The Athens Charter maintained that instead of connected low-rise housing lining the streets, housing should be provided in high-rise buildings located in the center of large lots away from streets and from each other in order to maximize open green space and natural light in the homes. Secondly, it maintained that these buildings should be raised onto pilotis to open up views from the ground and endow large buildings with a sense of lightness. Finally, it recommended that roofs be flat to offer additional living space. Urban design theory since the 1960s reverses each of these tenets, with towers and slabs giving way to houses and apartment buildings and with superblocks supplanted by city blocks. These changes have been applauded for providing a more human scale, offering more personalized and personalizable living spaces, and adding visual interest to the landscape. 70 concerted efforts to create high-quality public spaces have also produced some welcome results. In many instances, the return to the street from the shopping mall has been successful in bringing vitality back to street life. Increased attention to the provision of traditional public space, parks, plazas, and squares, as well as to landscaping has offered an antidote to the privatization and concreting of urban settings. Likewise, the effort to design mixed-use projects has provided an antidote to modernism's rigid and anti-urban separation of functions. And while hyper-real environments may be criticized for being artificial, it can be argued that it is precisely that quality which people like about them. Accused of distracting people from the injustices and ugliness of their lives, of placating them, and of being places of spectacle and surveillance, hyper-real environments might also be applauded for the diversion they offer, for simply providing places in which people can relax and have fun in the company of family and friends. 71 Other beneficial aspects of these environments are the vast multipliers they create in the local economy. And for urban designers, themed environments remain one of the few major opportunities to give full rein to their powers of creative expression. The critique of postmodern urbanism as enhancing settings for consumption is a double-edged sword that really boils down to a critique of consumption. While critics of mass society highlight the extent to which the market dictates our sense of identity, forces us to consume, and exacerbates social inequalities, others point out the market's potential for empowerment since we can personalize or resist that which it offers us. There is no question that people worldwide prefer abundance over scarcity, full shelves over empty ones, and that they vindicate their right to select from a variety of options along with their freedom to shop. As Lay and Mills have pointed out, access to goods is as much a facet of democratization as free elections and guarantees for the rights of the marginalized. Hardback editions for the few become the paperback editions for the many. And as long as we are going to shop, why not do so in a pleasant environment? While the preservation movement may be criticized for inventing histories and for advancing the interests of certain elites, the valorization it bespeaks of the existing urban fabric represents a welcome corrective to modernism's obsession with forgetting the past and starting over on a clean slate. It also suggests a valorization of cultural traditions and of cultural differences that was largely absent from modern urbanism. Indeed, many developers would say we have gone overboard in this direction as local communities' attachment to existing forms and nostalgia for the past lead them to rally behind saving every fast food restaurant in their neighborhood. And while movements to preserve nature or wildlife may sometimes be thinly veiled attempts to preserve the intimacy of one's community as well as land values, no one would deny the importance of designing in harmony with nature. The growing sensitivity towards the environment represents a great advance in contemporary urban design theory, expressed in terms of growth management or sustainable design. Such theory in practice focuses on design intervention that does not deplete any natural resources or impose hardship upon any people, and preferably enhances the environment and living conditions. 72 Most of the more exemplary recent urban design initiatives are engaged in healing scars left by interventions of the modern era, when the building of railroads and highways was undertaken with little consideration for the surrounding communities and natural landscapes. Much of this work has to do with reusing abandoned transit corridors, designing new ones, and redesigning existing fabrics both urban and suburban, sometimes in collaboration with local communities. While sharing the emphasis on enhancing the public realm with the neo-traditionalists, this tendency is not necessarily intent upon emulating past townscapes, but considers instead contemporary lifestyles and preferences and aspires to retain the valuable elements of modern urbanism and architecture. And rather than direct its focus to the traditional center, this tendency is more often concerned with the edge between the city, suburb, and countryside, between neighborhoods, and between functional uses, as well as the more metaphorical edges between disciplines, professions, and local communities. In its more extreme versions, it even champions the elimination of the traditional center, which brings with it old social inequalities. Speaking generally, Hal Foster describes this as a postmodernism of resistance or reaction entailing a critique of origins, not a return to them. Rather than preserve, renovate, or create a center or a past, this urban design theory holds that we should focus attention on the edge-periphery border with an eye towards the future. Acknowledging that most biological activity occurs in nature where different zones meet, for instance, Richard Sennett maintains that urban design has similarly to focus on the edge as a scene of life. Sensitive to the fragmentation of the built environment as well as among the urban design professions and between these and their constituents, then, designers have been increasingly setting themselves the task of mending seams. 73 In Western Europe, ironically, the concerted search for urbanity and the creation of centrality has been largely played out on urban wings rather than on center stage, as suburbs increasingly become the site for urbanization, immigration, and government subsidy for building. Consequently, many architects and planners began adapting these ideas to the building of satellite cities, industrial reuse, and the reorganization of suburban sprawl, as exemplified by the French program Banlieues 89, launched in 1985. Carriers of the modern torch also turned their gaze to suburbs because, as François Barre 74 maintained, classic urbanity loses its logic there. But modernity finds without a doubt a great many promising departures. Barre asserted, it is on the periphery that urban development is now taking place. The notion of center itself is dissolving. If the suburbs interest people today, it is precisely because of the wild production there which does not refer to any model but instead to a sort of superposition or collage. It is without doubt the most faithful representation of the present time. The suburb offers an accumulation of modesty and a slightly wild abundance. This reality expresses itself more through music, film, and the city than anything one could find in architecture. And the way one assesses the situation, he reminds us, depends on one's perspective, both geographical and ideological. Things look different depending on whether you look at them from the periphery or the center. Architects of all persuasions, then, grew interested in designing on the edges of cities, including Cryer, Rossi, Rem Koolhaas, and Stephen Hall. The apotheosis of this attention to the edge and to integrating functionalist tenets with the traditional city is found in the restructuring of the Barcelona waterfront, as overseen by the architect Oriol Bohigas. 75. With this renewed focus on the periphery, Donald Olson suggests, the central city may revert to its pre-industrial role as a work of art, designed for ostentation rather than for use, a symbol of prestige, a center of specialized consumption, a place to indulge in luxurious vice, to spend money made elsewhere. Or, this interest in the periphery may be symptomatic of the growing irrelevance of distinctions between the city, the suburb, and the countryside, and between urbanism and suburbanism as ways of life, as foreseen by Marx, Arthur Schlesinger, and Herbert Gans. The mending of seams has been central to a number of recent urban design initiatives in North America, as apparent, for instance, in the reuse of transit corridors. Landscape architect and urban designer Diana Balnori has proposed building a light rail system and greenway on the site of an abandoned canal and rail line connecting New Haven to the center of Connecticut and the Massachusetts border, to create a corridor that unites segregated communities and enhances pedestrian ways. The Greenway plan for metropolitan Los Angeles similarly centers on revitalizing 400 miles of abandoned rail and infrastructure rights-of-way as well as river and flood control channels. 76. And in Boston, where a tunnel is being substituted for the expressway which disrupted a formerly vibrant lower-middle-class neighborhood, Alex Krieger proposed restoring the urban fabric and interweaving it with open spaces in an effort to resonate with the past but also consider current and future uses. 77. The reuse of abandoned transit lines has been greatly assisted by the Rails to Trails Conservancy, a national nonprofit organization created in 1988 to assist local activists around the United States in converting abandoned railroad corridors into public linear parks, also called rail trails or rails with trails. With a nationwide membership in 1994 of 60,000, RTC had conducted 13 assessment studies around the country and almost 1,000 miles of trails had been constructed, with others in progress. Studies of rail trails in Baltimore, Seattle, and the East Bay of San Francisco reported that properties adjacent to the trails sold better than before the trails were built and that the trails also generate economic activity for the communities through which they pass. The design of new transportation hubs and corridors is another instance of healing scars and mending seams. A number of proposals for subway and light rail stations for the Los Angeles metropolitan area, for example, aspire to retain that which the local community values while providing that which it desires. Johnson, Fain and Pereira Associates devised a plan for a Chatsworth station which includes a replica of the historic Chatsworth station, a child care center, and other civic and commercial services, all linked to the natural landscape by pedestrian and bicycle paths. E. Smith, 6. For a more urban site, Koning Eisenberg Architects proposed a station in Hollywood which would retain the small scale of the residential blocks while providing market stalls clustered around the station along with a larger mercado, and necessary housing over shops at street level, all in an effort to enhance the neighborhood identity. California-based architects Mark Angelo and Sarah Graham sought to create a center for the town of Esslingen, Switzerland by clustering shops, offices, and housing around a railroad station, all heated and cooled by an extensive system of solar energy. E. Smith, 11. And in a plan for a highway corridor for the small town of Chanhassen in Minnesota, the architect William Morrish and landscape architect Catherine Brown aspired to retain the small town character which its inhabitants valued, preserve the natural environment, and integrate the new road into the community rather than allow it to divide and conquer the community. 78. A final emergent trend to note is the effort to go beyond shaping the physical environment, to also affect changes in public policy and in public opinion regarding the potential value of urban design. Along with DPZ and Calthorpe, Morrish and Brown are also engaged in these efforts, as demonstrated by their 1987 master plan for the public art program in Phoenix, which used art as a bridge between the public and those who make public policy, and in two more recent efforts in Minneapolis, one to create jobs while also providing a series of small neighborhood parks at the Hennepin County Works, and the other to better integrate public housing with private sector housing. A number of efforts to reclaim vacant lots for use by the surrounding neighborhoods also go beyond shaping the physical environment. The landscape architect Akva Benzenberg Stein, for instance, designed the Uhuru Garden in Watts, Los Angeles, to include gardens as well as facilities for instruction in gardening and for selling what is grown. Intended primarily for use by the local residents of a public housing project, students at the local public school, and members of a local drug rehabilitation center, this garden incorporates native California vegetation as well as indigenous irrigation techniques. Other efforts to convert vacant lots into community gardens in South Central Los Angeles have been undertaken from the grassroots by the LA Hope Horticulture Corps and the LA Regional Food Bank Garden. In certain regards, then, we might consider contemporary urban design theory as the mature young adulthood emerging and benefiting from the mistakes of its rebellious modern adolescence. 79 To best seize this moment, however, the urban design professions must be vigilant, a subject addressed in the following chapters.